So now we are ready to welcome the Professor David Snowden. David, welcome. David, you already had been in Brazil, so I think you know how we like the Knevin framework, right? That's why we are super excited to hear you in our events today. So thanks again for accept our invitation. The word is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that, and sorry I can't be with you. All right, and apologies for doing this from the car. I got delayed on my return home, so I pulled by the side of the motorway. The topic here is leadership under conditions of uncertainty, and I want to link that in with the recent publication we produced, or at least the European Commission Guide, or how to manage under complexity and uncertainty, and that's available online for free. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about is either hinted at or directly mentioned there. So there is now a field guide. It does have government endorsement. That's actually quite important. The second thing is I'm not going to talk about leadership as a sort of list of qualities that a leader should have. I've never really bought that, to be honest. I've worked with CEOs in major companies. And to be quite honest, they have very, very little in common, except an awful lot of them tend to be arrogant bastards, but you don't tend to see that in the leadership books. The reality is a leader is part of a highly complex ecosystem. And often leaders in an organization, certainly at the top of an organization, have far less power than middle management. They can give direction, they can actually deal with investment, but they don't have the information available to make decisions on a day-to-day basis. So there are issues on senior leadership, and one of the key messages or the key context we bring out of the EU Field Guide is that you really need to lead by coordination and distribute decision making. So I want to spend a little bit of time on that. Then I'm going to start to look at leadership within teams and leadership at all levels on the organization. So the concept of leadership as coordination and distributing decision making is a key one. So I've been a C-level executive for a significant amount of my time. Right? And what actually happens is about 5 or 6 people come into your office. They've got very sophisticated presentations. They're deep experts in their field. They've worked on the problem for ages, and they've all got recommendations. And somehow or other, you're magically expected to decide which is the right one. And you haven't got the time. Typically, you get maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes, sometimes 15, 20. Generally, you've got very time poor, and you've got to make decisions very, very quickly. Now, the problem with that is that given that you can't validate the evidence that is presented to you, you end up with a little bit of gut feel, or it tends to be, well, the guy who got the decision right last time, he hasn't got anything wrong for a long time, so I'll go with him. Or it can like, well, she's really well qualified in this field, so maybe she's the expert, so maybe I should make judgment. So it's actually quite difficult to make that decision. So from that, we start, and this is where I'll start to use Knevin, and start to go through some basic techniques which you can apply. And again, I'll say this deliberately, you're trying to avoid making the decision. You're trying to create the conditions under which the decision is largely self-evident, because then that will be more sustainable and resilient. So if we take the different types of system defined by the Knevin framework, we have ordered systems, complex systems, and chaotic systems. So ordered systems are characterized by a high level of constraint and predictability, a high level of degree to which things are actually context-free. So the same thing will generally happen again the same way twice. A complex system is characterized by very different phenomena. The same thing is very rarely successful a second time round. It might be partially successful, but actually different things work in different contexts. The situation has many possible situations, all of which could be realized or unrealized, there's massive dissension, there's no obvious solution. The way we sometimes describe a complex system is to say that it's entangled, rather like a mangrove swamp, or if you ever sort of try and break into a jungle area where you've got undergrowth and trees and everything is entangled with everything else. You kind of like know there are different plants and you know that there is some sort of structure there, but you can't manage it. In fact, you tend to have to hack through it. You know, you pull one branch, something else comes out and hits you in the back. So everything is interconnected. And it's because of that huge amount of interconnection that you have inherent uncertainty. In a chaotic environment, well, that's random, right? It's a sudden crisis. And that's actually kind of like the one area where you make decisive decisions. So if we go into COVID, and I'm giving national examples here, and I'll be careful who I mention. The Prime Minister of New Zealand actually broke a law. She recognized the situation and she took decisive action to lock the country down so nobody could get in or out. Now, what she was doing was not to decide what the right thing to do was or wasn't, but she knew if she did that, she would keep more options open for longer. And the key thing to do in a crisis is you can't resolve the crisis, but you can make decisions which hold options open for longer. In contrast with that, in the US, within Britain and Sweden, they waited till they had no choice to lock down, at which point their options were significantly less. So in the chaotic domain of Cynefin, you make decisive decisions, but the decisions you make are designed to increase the number of options available to you, not to close them down, but to get some sense of stability or direction. In the complex domain, that's kind of like where you've got 5 or 10 people, they've all got coherent ideas, they all think they know how to do it. You send them all away and say, okay, guys, I want a 1 to 3 month safe to fail experiment based on what you think should happen, which will indicate whether this is the right thing to do or not. You don't choose between the 5 propositions, you give them all a small amount of resource to run safe to fail experiments in parallel. Now that parallelism is key to understanding complexity. I'm not talking about methods today, but it's one of the reasons why we say Scrum is an extremely effective technique to make complex things complicated, but it's not a truly complex technique because it iterates one thing to get it right. Whereas in a truly complex situation, you want 4 or 5 parallel iterations going on with people with very different ideas and a high degree of contradiction. Because, and these are probes more than experiments. Those probes will change the nature of the space, the nature of your perception, so you can start to see or perceive a way forward. So if it's complex, you do parallel safe to fail experimentation. Now, when you get into ordered environments, we divide those normally into 2. One is where the relationship between cause and effect is clear, and one where the relationship between cause and effect is actually complicated and probably only knowable through analysis or expertise. Now, leaders should not be making decisions in the clear space. There should be processes, there should be controls, there should be rules, there should be regulations. The only role of the leader in that space is actually to check for deviation. Because if people keep having to break the rules to get the job done, it's probably time for you to examine those rules again. And that's something I've recommended to many leaders over the years. If you're starting to get disobedience, look at why. Because people generally aren't malicious. They're often having to break the rules, otherwise things don't get done which need to get done. In the complicated domain, on the other hand, you can trust experts. Basically, you've got a high level of constraint, provided you've got people with the right background and right qualification. If they say this is what you should do, just go and do it. Now, you also get a constant situation where you have competing experts. So different experts from different backgrounds are both arguing for different approaches. Now, this is not the same thing as the complex domain, actually one or other of them is right. So, for example, in the UK in COVID, we had a massive dispute between behavioral psychologists, economists, and epidemiologists. And from a decision maker's point of view, this is very difficult because each of the people has high levels of expertise, but the action that they're suggesting doesn't go forward. Now, in a 45-minute keynote, I can't explain this in detail, but we developed a formal method for this called a triopticon. And you can read up on that. We have an open source wiki for our methods, knevin.io. And there's a full write-up at this with a simulation of how it works. But what you actually do is say you've got three experts from different backgrounds with different views. You give them each an opportunity to present their ideas with response, but without sort of interaction. And then you have, shall we say, PhD students or junior people with the same degree of expertise. You have a very complex dance over a day as these different groups of people interact with each other so that you can identify what solutions or pathways are possible. Now, I say that's a three-stage process. It's highly structured, it's highly designed, and that's one thing which is available to you. So in the complicated domain, trust the expert, or if you've got conflict, run this highly ritualized environment. Now, you'll notice that what I'm doing a leader at this point is I'm not making the decision. I'm creating connectivity and process by which what is the right thing to do will become more self-evident. And that's the key principle. So centralized coordination, distribute decision-making, recognize the different domains, chaos, complex, order, and take the appropriate action. So that's one body of stuff. And to be honest, that applies more or less at all levels of management. I've talked about major government work because that's where I'm spending much of my time at the moment, but it would apply in a small team as well. However, there are other things which are really important for effective leadership. So over the course of the last 6 months, since we started, we finalized the EU field guide, we were ready to launch it, I've interviewed the best part of 100 senior executives in government and industry worldwide. And one of the few things they all say in common is that what really mattered in the crisis was their informal networks, not their formal processes. Now that matches what we know from a theoretical basis, because if you construct a process, you assume the type of information which that process will have. So in a real crisis, you haven't got process. If you had a process, you wouldn't be in a crisis. You're in a crisis because you got something which was unanticipatable, or possibly anticipatable, but you couldn't resource it. That's actually more frequent. So what you do under those circumstances is you tend to fall back on your informal networks. And informal networks are what are called context-free communication channels. They're built because people have worked together, they joined the company at the same time, they went to the same school, they have the same sports interests, they're in the same book club, whatever. There's thousands of ways in which informal networks form. But the informal networks actually haven't been designed around specific types of communication. An informal network is based on, I trust these people, therefore I can talk with them. And you'll see this often in organizations. You may not know somebody who knows something, but a friend of yours does, and they'll link and connect you, and you trust more in that relationship because it's validated in that way. So again, one of the things that we've created for leaders is a method called entangled trios. And there's two actually, entangled trios, and the other is social network stimulation. They're designed to get everybody in the organization within 3 phone calls of everybody else within about 9 months to a year. And what I'm doing is I'm building network density across silos. And I'm allowing the informal networks to manage information flow that I can't yet anticipate. Now that is taking me back 20 years to my initial work on knowledge management in IBM, where we identified that the ratio between informal to formal communities was about 60-1. And those were only the ones using technology to work together. And that was before we had things like Slack, which are those sort of workspaces pop up all over the place. And the reality is nothing got done in IBM through the formal process. Everything got done through the informal networks. And kind of like that's a healthy system. If you want a biological metaphor, if you look at soil, say you've got trees and a healthy crop in the soil, what you'll actually find is the roots of the trees are connected to each other by the root system of fungi, which extend about 500 times the distance of the tree roots themselves. And the fungi provide nutrients and water to the tree, in return for which they get sucrose. It's called a symbiotic relationship. And soil health is highly dependent on these multi-threaded, multi-entangled, deeply complex connections. And that's really a metaphor for the informal system. If your organization is deeply connected at this microscopic, semi-microscopic level, then the system as a whole has a resilient capacity to respond in a crisis. So building networks across silos is actually much more effective than trying to break down those silos, which you won't be able to do anyway. And as I say, there are formal methods within the open source wiki which you can run to help on that. Yeah. And there's I'll come back to government level briefly on that. I was talking on a think tank the other day. If you look at a state like Singapore, which has been very effective in COVID, then you'll actually see that they have dense informal networks within the civil service, but that comes from the fact they all did military service together. So it's a meritocratic, broadly spread network. Whereas if you come to the UK, the informal networks at government level are based on having attended one of 2 or 3 elite schools or colleges. So they lack the requisite diversity to really be that healthy. In fact, they're leading to corruption, if I'm quite honest about it. So managing your informal networks, building that connectivity, it is quite important. And certainly when I was in a strategy leadership role, I spent about 40% of my time walking around the office. I always carried something, so it looked like I was being purposeful. But what I was really doing was just finding a way to drop in for a cup of coffee, get called in to have a chat with somebody, drop in on a meeting. I was building that informal, fragmented, casual network, which meant I could sense patterns or possibilities, which we could feed into more formal structures or processes. So I can't overemphasize this. A good leader builds a good network around the way they work. Now, what I've said so far is generic to leadership itself. And it argues for a diverse approach to leadership, doing different things in different contexts. I think the Agile movement, and I'm going to talk about the movement as well as leadership within specific teams, is not in a particularly good space at the moment, largely because an awful lot of what's Agile is now is being highly commodified, highly structured. You've got the various framework wars. You've got people adopting, things which will take 2 or 3 years to produce any recognizable benefit. I think it rather ironic that the Agile manifesto talks about people over processes, but most Agile is process and tools, when you actually look at it. And where the leadership is coming from is difficult to see. Now, one of the things I'm talking about a lot in organizations at the moment is what we call rewilding Agile. And the rewilding concept is not a return to something, wild and original. We can't go back to the time of the manifesto. The world has moved on considerably, over the last 20 odd years. But you can restore some of the balance. Rewilding is about restoring balance. And what actually happened when Agile took off is there were 3 core components within the original manifesto writers. One was XP, the other was Scrum, and the third was DSDM. Actually, I was one of the 3 founders of that, going way back before. Dynamic system design methodology. Now, out of those 3, the one which had, and I'm referencing Max Brasso's work here in Knowledge Assets, for anybody who knows that, is Scrum was codified and structured at a level of abstraction, which meant it was easy to train and easy to pick up. Whereas XP, which I would argue was more authentic to the spirit of Agile, was based on deep expertise and deep experience, and wasn't at the same level of abstraction and codification. So the Agile movement actually built around Scrum. Yeah. And then we got all the spin-offs and all the other things which came from that. So part of what we need to start to think about is the way we look at those frameworks and the way we look at those methods and how we provide leadership to teams. Right? Now, coaching is something that the Agile movement has pioneered, and coaching is a very different type of leadership from direction. It's kind of like in the spirit of what I was talking about earlier. It's making it possible for people to see new possibilities and open up new possibilities rather than telling them what to do. And there are several things there that we can do differently within Agile. One of the bigger issues is the whole way in which we determine what goes into the funnel. And part of the problem here is that Agile generally runs off a manufacturing metaphor. You see all the stuff out of Lean, you have flows, you have processes. The idea is somebody will tell us what we should produce. We'll put it into this process, and then our role as team lead or whatever is to execute and deliver to that original product owner or process. Now, one of the areas we focused on now for 4 or 5 years is actually changing the dynamics of the way you feed data into that system. And part of the big thing which is going on with technology at the moment is technology can do things which users don't know how to ask for. In fact, users aren't aware that there are technological problems. They pick up on trendy words like, we need to be digital. Yeah. You don't need to be digital. Digital might be a way of achieving business goals. We get this the wrong way around. But they're not really aware of some of the really radical things that you can do. I mean, we work in developing advanced training data sets, for example, for algorithms, which can trigger anticipatory alerts. And that comes from our counterterrorism work, which is you can't predict a terrorist outrage, but you can trigger the attention of executives when the possibility or the plausibility of terrorist outrage is higher, so they can focus on an area. We've taken that work across into anticipating or triggering alerts on, for example, premature discharge within hospitals. And most recently, a whole body of work we're doing on old people's homes, which involve continuous mass observation of microdata, and then using the training data sets that come to that to trigger attention, for example, to lack of care or abuse. Now, that concept or approach is not very well known, so users may have a problem, but they don't know how to define that as a solution. So you get too many levels of what we call mediation, or too many interpretive layers between the original situation of the user and the actual thing that you need to produce in terms of software. Now, there are better ways to do this. One is, effort we've worked on for years, which is mapping unarticulated needs. So collecting the day-to-day frustrations and experiences of users and creating clusters of micro-narratives, and those replace story points. So basically, clusters of micro-narratives of users' experience go into rapid prototyping. This is a pre-Scrum approach in which people with deep knowledge of what technology can do respond to those micro-narratives and create effectively an evolutionary process between the two. One of the other things we do a lot of now is we use trios again. So we'll put young, bright programmer, state-of-the-art capability, really fast, really bright, together with somebody who's older, more experienced, a systems architect and end user tester. And then the third member of the trio is a user trained to talk to IT people. And it's a lot easier to train users to talk to IT people than to train IT people to understand users. So we'll create that as a trio. And then we'll throw 10 or 15 trios at a problem for a couple of weeks and see what they come up with. So we're increasing the diversity and the parallelism, of what goes on before something goes into a structured process. And a large part of the responsibility of leadership in Agile is to think about the wider picture in the big system and where different methods and different tools come into play. So one of the things, in fact, we just come off a 3-4 week masterclass. And I think that masterclass is going to be brought into Brazil shortly. There's discussions on that. And one of the things we've been looking is to look through the whole of the Agile method kit and decompose methods to what's called their lowest level of coherent granularity. So I can take something like Scrum and I can decompose it to things like retrospective, sprints, whatever. And I can start to do interesting things. So I can take out a 2-week sprint and replace it with a 3-month time box. I can take out a punctuated time retrospective and replace it with continuous journaling across the team. So what we're starting to build now is an ability to use a multi-vendor, multi-tool approach to dealing with Agile projects, in which you don't choose one framework, you build different aspects of different frameworks together in different contexts. And that's quite an exciting development. And again, that fits into this question. The role of the leader is to keep options open and to actually manage diverse experiments so that the nature and the type of solution becomes clearer. Now, you'd have realized by now that, as I said at the start, I haven't talked much about qualities or individual qualities. Now, there are some things that we know are important. If you want to be a leader, you need to develop an ability to handle failure, both in yourself and in others. You also need to recognize that there are very much. Part of the reason you're there is to make difficult decisions. And I think human judgment is something we don't work well with. And often, again, something we were talking about earlier on today, we've forgotten the need for a sort of an apprenticeship to lead to a journeyman, to lead to a master. We kind of like assume that we can just train people and forget about all that experience you need to go through to get there. So I'll give a personal story on this to illustrate this. I've been very lucky in my life. When I was working for large corporations, I only had one bad boss, and he wasn't that bad. I had 5 brilliant ones. And one of the first ones was a guy called Bob. So he was financial director of the company I worked for. I was de facto his deputy. I got the job because I stood up to him once and he liked people who argued with him. And I was now running the treasury side of the accounts department, and also my major role, about 80% of my time, was actually computerizing the whole of accounts. Yeah. And these are the days before computers, or we had mainframes. So we were bringing stuff in-house. We were developing code. We were actually buying application packages, and that was my responsibility. So I was both a computer expert, a software programmer, and an accountant. And that combination of 3 was quite valuable. So in my accounting role, I found a group of electrical engineers who were actually defrauding their expenses. They'd all put in a claim for a taxi from the station to a hotel for a training venue. And I knew, because I previously worked in training and HR, so I knew their venues, that this hotel was right next to the station and there were only 2 trains a day. So there was no way that 15 electrical engineers all had a $50 taxi fare. Yeah, so this was obviously something weird. So I went to the financial director and said, I've caught these guys, I'm going to fire them. And he said, no, you're not. Electrical engineers are very difficult and very expensive to recruit. We need to think of something else. He said, leave it till the weekend. Yeah. Now, we were both in that weekend. These are the days when to run the general ledger took about 48 hours of processing, right? And you had to stay in to look after it. So we were both in, and we went down to the workshop where the electrical engineers met and where they did their business. And he sat on a stool and smoked a pipe and asked me to hunt around. So I opened drawers, opened cupboards. And after about 20 minutes, I found a drawer full of blank receipt books. And what was happening is they were just collecting blank receipts from around the world and using them to support expense claims so they could get more money than they were entitled to. And I said, Bob, you're brilliant. All right. You know, it's obvious we should fire the guy in charge of them as well, because he's obviously complicit in us. And he said, no, we're not going to do that. He said, get one of those big metal trays from the Marine Yard. We were a survey company. And he said, tip all of the contents of that drawer onto the tray. So I did that. And then he stood down from the stool and he tapped his pipe out on the paper so that it gradually burnt into a smouldering mess. And we left it there for them to find on the Monday when they came in. So they knew that we knew that we knew that they knew, and nobody said anything. But they radically changed their behavior. And about 3 months later, Bob increased their expense allowances because he said, they're telling us we're not paying them enough. They're good people. We've just put them in a position where they've done bad things. Now, I learned a huge amount from that about trying to avoid to jump into things too quickly and instead focus on understanding and going deeper and actually not using authority in the sense of power, but using authority in the sense of being able to present different perspectives and see things from other points of view. And again, I think that's something we need to develop in people. Yeah. I've been climbing mountains this week. I'm still quite proud of the fact on Tuesday, we actually spent 17 hours walking 30 miles with a climb of 6,300 feet. And I've climbed all my life. I've been on mountain rescue. And one of the things you learn in leadership in those highly stressed physical environments is your job is to stay calm and to anticipate what could go wrong rather than deal with situations as they arise. So that anticipatory awareness, that ability to do things now, which keep options open, which actually, you're not, anticipation isn't prediction. It's getting ready for things that you can't actually fully predict in that sense. So I've tried to give a sort of general sort of theory of leadership. I've tried to make that relevant to both Agile as well as government and elsewhere. The principles are fairly similar. There isn't a recipe which makes you a leader. And one of the big metaphors I use a lot is the difference between a recipe book user and a chef. So a recipe book user follows a process. They follow a framework. They do it the way the framework says. So if they ever don't have the right ingredients or the right equipment, there's nothing they can do. A chef, on the other hand, will come into your kitchen and will produce a wonderful meal with whatever you happen to have lying around, because they understand not only the theory of taste, but they've served a long apprenticeship and they've got the experience. Their fingers know how to do things, so they can adjust rapidly under conditions of uncertainty. So if you are going to be a leader, you need to focus on 5 separate things. Yeah? And it's easy to remember this. It comes with a mnemonic called ASHEN, A-S-H-E-N. So you need to handle artifacts. So those are tools and frameworks and processes and rules and regulations. That's part of the environment. Yeah? Nothing wrong with that, but it's only one of 5. Yeah? You need to understand skills and skill acquisition. There are some skills it can take 2 or 3 years to acquire. Some skills can be picked up in a 2-day training course. You can never be a master of anything after a 2-day training course, but you can pick up some skills. So you need to understand the skills balance of the needs of your team and the possible future skills and the time for acquisition and the process for acquisition, because if you've got a 3-year acquisition of skills, that's very different from a 2-day one. And the third thing you need to understand are what are called heuristics or rules of thumb. Now, I'll give you an example. The American Marines, if the battlefield plan breaks down, they fall back to 3 simple rules. 3 simple rules: stay in touch, keep moving, capture the high ground. Now, those are heuristics because they give general guidance under conditions of uncertainty. And identifying heuristics from experts and actually producing those is very valuable. But heuristics have to be explicit. They're not abstract principles. So you're managing artifact skills, heuristics, and then experience. part of your job is to expose people, to train them, to acquire more experience yourself, to bring in experience from outside. And finally, and I come into a close here, is natural talent. Some people are just better at things than others. So if you've got those people, you need to find a way to nurture them. And you won't nurture people with high levels of natural talent by taking highly structured competence-based frameworks and trying to make a one-size-fits-all approach. So what I've tried to do in 40 minutes and leave 5 minutes for questions is give some general principles of leadership, point to some tools and practices, and try and get people to understand leadership is a highly complex phenomenon in which you're the conductor of an orchestra, rather than a military leader.
Thank you, Dave. You always bring great stories as you talk today. Thank you very much. So, Dave, this is an event for leaders. So the obvious question is, in your experience, what is the top common mistake leaders make when they are dealing with the complexity? I know you talk about leadership, so I try to understand what is the big mistake.
The big mistake is to try and define outcome rather than start a journey. If you're in a complex environment, you need to start a journey with a sense of direction and be open to new possibilities, not have specific goals. And leaders have this habit of saying, I need this, right? What you need to say is, I need to move in this direction. The other thing is, good leaders share stories of failure and their own failure. They don't share stories of success, because avoidance of failure is a more successful strategy. If you talk about how you failed, people will feel freer, but they will avoid that failure. You don't define the future. So that would be my first response, I think. Okay, right. Another question is, today we had Brian Robertson here talking about holacracy. So how do you think this kind of system fits with the complexity environment in an auto-organized system? It doesn't. Don't go near it with a barge pole. It's a total disaster. Sorry, I'm working with an organization that adopted it. And I mean, I like Brian. He's a really nice guy, which is why I haven't attacked it often in public. But Brian comes from a computer programming background, and people like that don't like to exercise judgment. So he wrote a set of algorithms so nobody would have to exercise judgment. And therefore, if you understand the algorithms and you control the process, you can create a new form of bureaucracy. In fact, we're undoing that work at the moment. So you can't replace human judgment with algorithms, right? And the cost of holacracy has been high. I mean, Zappos laid off 300 staff because they wouldn't go along with it. I don't count that as a success. And I've yet to see a sustained success over a long period of time, right? The other thing is that methods which don't require leaders, which have to be imposed in a draconian way by leaders, kind of like that's a contradiction. Yeah. So nice idea, cute idea, but you can't write a computer program. We take a different approach. We use, and this is how we organize, we have people organized in groups of 3 or 5 or 7. And if all 3 or 5 or 7 are agreed on what should happen within a discrete area, they do it. But the 3s and the 5s and 7s overlap. Yeah, so there's coordination, and, you know, the senior guide, me in this case, can step in if needed. So we have a much more fluid, organic structure. Yeah, but as I say, sorry about this, and I'm quite happy to do an open debate on Brian on this. Yeah, holacracy is wrong in theory and bad in practice. Okay, Davis, thank you so much. Great thoughts, great ideas today with you. Thank you very much.